This is an example of an IWC criticism that I just can't stand. And here is another example of something that the internet always says is the solution, only for it to not be true. When it comes to fandom, there are many times where the audience knows exactly how to improve a product. But on occasion, there are some times where they couldn't be more off course. And I'm just so tired of hearing these things. Which is exactly why just 10 of these particular notions are the topic of this episode. Because today, a big thank you to my supporters over on Patreon, such as Dakari Garmin, Mr. J, Ron Hawthorne, Minji Stray, Harry Flynn, and The Reflection of Perfection. Thank you so much for all the help. It really does mean a lot. Alright, so when it comes to professional wrestling, it does seem like, well, everybody's a critic. And while we all have the right to voice our opinions, you kinda have to admit, when you've been hanging around the internet and talking about wrestling for a while, you start to notice patterns. Now, in some cases, this can be a good thing, as it makes it rather obvious what wrestling needs to do to improve. However, on the other hand, there are some examples where it really does more harm than good, especially when a whole mass of internet wrestling fans start saying the same thing, without realizing that the criticism may not be 100% accurate and therefore won't actually solve any problems. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the list, and just be aware that this is simply a small sampling of the kind of criticisms that I'm talking about, as there are plenty more that I'm not going to cover in this video. Anyway, with that being said, let's get into the list. The term overrated pretty much signifies that you don't like something simply because you feel that too many people like it, or that the people who do like it too much. And this is damaging because it means you're not really formulating an opinion of your own. You're allowing what other people think to influence you. And sure, we also know that the internet is just a breeding ground for people to say the complete opposite of whatever the majority seems to be saying. Because you know, that's what the internet has trained us to think a conversation is. Now, this is not saying that there aren't wrestlers who are indeed rated higher than they should be, or have more of a following than they probably deserve. But instead of oversimplifying things and allowing yourself to be guilty of a knee-jerk reaction that's caused by the masses, perhaps you should take the time to really break down why whatever you think is shoved down our throats leaves a bad taste in your mouth to start. Which is so much more productive than simply saying that somebody's overrated. And when you stop thinking about how someone is rated, this encourages you to think for yourself and formulate your own opinions, which is very valuable and something that I don't think we do often enough anymore. Living in a post-Family Guy world is an entire generation of adults who have grown up thinking that obscure references are a substitute for good storytelling. And this is a real shame, because there are fans out there who think that a good story has to do with referencing things that already happened, and not realizing that it takes a whole lot more than a case of member berries to make something good. And this is not to say that there's anything wrong with Easter eggs in and of themselves. They're great and they can be a lot of fun, but they cannot make a match, they cannot make a storyline good. How many disillusioned fans out there have conflated the idea of fighting spirit with no selling, and rationalizing their decision by saying that anything that happens is a callback to some match that happened in New Japan years ago, only to then typically follow it up with something along the lines of, "Not every fan gets this reference, but I do, therefore it's good." And that right there is the issue. I completely sympathize with anybody who has way too much knowledge about a trivial subject, especially if you occasionally start to wonder, did I waste my life? And don't get it twisted. Just because a wrestling show references your obscure knowledge, that doesn't mean that you're justified or validated in it. And adding to this, when we see a lot of hardcore fans pitching their fantasy angles, all too often they decide that it's going to center around some deep cut or some piece of information from the wrestlers' personal lives as the means to begin an angle, which is no way to run a railroad. Writing wrestling is like writing any other fiction. Start with a story arc, an emotional arc, have the characters go through change, as that's what's going to get the masses to care about wrestling again. But you know what won't? Is a random wink and a random nod to some obscure detail that only super fans would know, as that is kinda off-putting to a lot of people who may not be as into wrestling as you are. And yes, we do need those fans, we do need those casual fans. It can't all be about the hardcores. But speaking of which, that leads me to Nerds really do have a hard time accepting that sometimes not everything is made for them. While sure, they may still be in the key demo, the reality is wrestling sometimes has bigger motivations outside of just what you specifically want. Hence the major backlash for the PG era. While it was nice for a lot of fans who got to grow up with Hulkamania and then go to the Attitude Era during their adolescence, sometimes you just gotta reset the switch and start aiming at a younger demographic. Because hey, there's a lot of revenue to be made from toys, and if we're going to have future wrestling fans, well, we're gonna have to start getting them into wrestling early. And plus, a lot of corporate sponsors don't really want to see edgier products, as they want something more family friendly to represent their brand, as again, that is a much bigger audience. So I can't stress enough, this is not always about you. And sure, I do personally love ECW and I love the Attitude Era, and I do love more edgy content in my professional wrestling, but I am also aware that it's not always about my personal preferences. And furthermore, for those who say that TV PG is just simply inferior, are not only missing the point that it makes more money, but also they're forgetting that the rock and wrestling experience was as squeaky clean and polished as it could possibly get. And they're also ignoring that WWE has broken their TV PG rating every once in a while, like the episode where Alexa Bliss was caught changing, only for the PG defamers not to notice that more mature content has been brought to WWE TV every once in a while, and that's primarily because it really hasn't made much of a difference. So simply bringing back more mature content isn't going to boost the ratings anymore, and it also doesn't appear to be more financially successful, at least not in modern times. And yes, there are rumblings that WWE Raw will be going to TVMA once it arrives at Netflix, but we have to remember yet again that more mature content doesn't necessarily mean better storytelling, and that's what it's all about. Now this is something that even professional wrestlers can be guilty of, and that's booking towards the pop, basing your actions off of how much of a crowd reaction you can get. Now sure, there's nothing wrong with getting pops, and some of you are wondering how could this possibly be a bad thing, but while it's not the pop itself that's bad, it's the incredible short-sightedness of only booking towards that one single moment instead of basing your entire match or your entire storyline off of a well-constructed plot. You'll often hear fans saying, imagine the heat he'll get, or imagine the pop, but that's just one fleeting moment. Going to the world of movies, Steven Spielberg famously said that in the movie Jaws, he started to get greedy and he wanted to add one more scare, and so he did, but then test audiences didn't react the same to the rest of the film, and this taught him that the audience will eventually begin to distrust you. They'll be on guard and they won't be as easy to get later on, and this exact same level of group psychology works in professional wrestling as well. When you take the time to properly build something and take your audience along on a journey and get them fully invested, then you'll get better reactions than if you just went straight for the cheap pop. And sure, jumping off of a ladder outside of the ring headfirst into a thumbtack might get a great squeal from the audience, but it won't have the staying power or the emotional resonance that a well-told story can get. And on the reverse side, there are plenty of things you can do just to spite the local crowd, but that isn't going to grow your business, it isn't going to raise your ratings, and it's not what professional wrestling is really all about. And yet I still hear some fans say things like, WWE should do this because it would be a big middle finger to AEW, as if that was important in any way, shape, or form. But alas, some people's entire booking concept revolves around one visceral reaction, and nothing else. Now this is a criticism I think most IWC fans are at least familiar with, but we gotta state the obvious sometimes. And it's that there are a lot of fans out there that whenever they see a babyface that's just not working out or not getting over with the fans, their first response and their first solution is to simply turn them heel. And after all, why not? This did wonders for Roman Reigns, and it could have prevented John Cena from being so hated. And if someone is getting booed to begin with, well, why not just run with it? Now, while there is a lot of validity to this way of thinking, and it has benefited certain wrestlers, that doesn't mean that this is a cure-all for every single time a babyface just can't connect with audiences. And there are multiple external factors that we have to consider. For example, let's look at John Cena and all the good work he's done with the Make-A-Wish Foundation and all of the toys and merchandise that he sells. Sure, as we saw with Roman Reigns, a heel turn really doesn't affect merch as much as it used to, but WWE didn't necessarily know that. And so, why take the risk with something that's working well just because there's a creative slump? It's not always about the kayfabe. And furthermore, just because a wrestler is getting heat from the crowd, that doesn't mean that they'll make a good heel, as there's some wrestlers that just aren't good at either, and getting them to break bad might just result in them getting go away heat instead of them finding their groove. I don't know where this started, but somewhere along the line, some people got it in their head that if they simply say, "You can't compare two things, they're different," that passes as an intelligent comment. But sadly, it really isn't. Let's go over the actual definition of the word compare, which means to estimate, measure, or note the similarity or dissimilarity between, which means that anytime someone says that you can't compare two things because they're too different, and then goes on to explain how those things are different, they're doing the exact thing they said that you can't do. And yes, this happens all the time, and the irony is always lost on the person doing it. Now, a major reason for this confusion, and I can't believe I have to explain this to people, possibly stems from the phrase, "It's like comparing apples to oranges," as there are people who erroneously believe that you cannot, under any circumstances, compare the two fruits, which is not the case because of course you can. For example, one is red, sometimes green, and the other is, well, orange. They both grow on trees, one is a citrus fruit, and the other is part of the nickname for New York City. You see, there you go, I just compared apples to oranges. But what this phrase actually means is that you can't answer which is the superior flavor because not only is that a matter of opinion, but because both flavors are just completely different, there's no point in trying to say which one is better. This is especially true because comparing opinions with objectivity is, well, impossible. However, things like facts can be compared, and we compare them all the time. Which number is greater, which happened earlier, which made the most money. All these things can be compared, and relatively easily. And so, by dismissing any comparison is really problematic because it's counterintuitive to any kind of progression and any kind of productive conversation. Take for example, my recent video on how the world of independent wrestling can learn a thing or two from the world of independent gaming, because there were indeed comments that said you couldn't compare the two as they were too different. And to that I have to say, this is all about what one industry could learn from the other, and for that to happen, they need to be different from one another. It'd be pretty hard for something to grow if we just compare it to something else that's exactly the same. And I know this is the exact kind of semantical thing that the internet loves nitpicking over, as there are going to be people complaining about my definition of compare even though I showed it on screen, and also some other people who are going to say that my interpretation of the phrase apples and oranges is incorrect. But hey, all trolls are losers and they just can't help themselves now, can they? But before you go off on your little mini rant down in the comments section, I do have to point out that this is exactly the problem, as people are too hung up on the minutia of something instead of seeing the bigger picture, the overall idea. As the exact problem is that some fans just can't see the forest before the trees, because as I pointed out, I was trying to talk about how to improve independent wrestling, but instead you rather get all hung up on the idea of what you can and cannot compare. But hey, that's only holding you back, nobody else. The stereotype of professional wrestling fans being a bunch of basement-dwelling unemployed losers really doesn't get disproven when people say things like, they should go back to the indies. Now for this, first, let's put aside all the other misconceptions people have about the indies. I'm specifically focusing on the criticism that a lot of wrestling fans seem to think that any wrestler that's not getting pushed to the moon in WWE is better off going to the independents. Or, and even though they're not necessarily the same thing, smaller promotions such as TNA. Because the major issue with this line of thinking is that it's severely overlooks a major component of a wrestler's career, and it's their career, it's their job, they're here to make money. And if you had the slightest clue on how little professional wrestlers make on the independents, then you would probably start to hesitate before you use the word professional. And this is not a knock or a slight on any independent wrestlers or any of the weekend warriors or anyone who uses wrestling as their side hustle, but meanwhile has a shoot job that they do 9 to 5. But rather, this is simply pointing out that for a lot of wrestlers, their financial situation is much more important to them than whether or not they win a fictional prize. Because let's remember that when you are a champion, you didn't actually win anything, you didn't compete for anything. This whole thing is scripted. So suggesting that a wrestler should put their own monetary well-being or the well-being of their family underneath that of a scripted prize just goes to show how little some people understand about how the working world works. And I mean that in every sense of the word. As to paraphrase Aleister Black, who said that he didn't didn't regret his time in WWE at all, since it was during that time that he got to meet his wife and became filthy rich as a result. Why would anybody regret that? Although, when you're dealing with a bunch of fans of a fictional sport, it really should be no surprise that some of them just have zero grasp on reality. The internet has a tendency to think that things are either 100% one way or 100% the other. If you criticize anything, it's because you hate it with all your heart. If you praise anything, it's because you're a complete and total mark for that thing. The internet just doesn't understand gray area or nuance. And more importantly, this simple way of thinking tends to bifurcate everything into being either one side or the other, such as people who would say things like, "That's why I'll take personality over work rate any day of the week," as if you had to make that distinction and you could only choose one. Because if you think like that, are you trying to tell me that Macho Man wasn't a good wrestler? Or that Kurt Angle was completely devoid of personality? The truth is, you can ask for both, and in fact, you should. Demand more from your professional wrestling, and stop thinking that you have to make a choice between one skill or the other. And additionally, let's also not pretend that there are just two skills needed in professional wrestling, or anything else, as oftentimes you have way more than two sides. But alas, there are so many people on the internet who just want to be Harvey Dent. So stop trying to oversimplify everything, as every once in a while it's going to require just a little more thought than just flipping a coin. There seems to be a portion of the fanbase out there that loves saying that blah 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 is the new blah blah blah. For example, Cody Rhodes is the new Lex Luger, Otis is the new Dusty Rhodes, Roman Reigns is the new John Cena, John Cena is the new Hulk Hogan, AEW is the new WCW, TNA is the new WCW, AEW is the new TNA, and so on and so forth. The point of the matter is, identifying some similarities between two things really doesn't help a lot, at least not in this context, which makes it especially baffling when people ask me, "Is it true that something is the new something else?" as they genuinely expect an answer. But what difference does it make if I say yes, if I say no? It doesn't change anything. And of course, no two things are ever exactly the same, as we saw from this year's WrestleMania, with Cody proving that he's very different from what happened to Lex Luger, as he would eventually go on to win the WWE Championship unlike the total package. But even if Cody wound up finishing his story exactly the same way that Lex Luger did, what's the benefit in being able to identify this? Where's the insight? And how does it help to try and ask some random YouTuber if they can confirm or deny this? This will not help you predict what will happen in the future, and you would be much better off by saying that something could benefit by not repeating the same mistakes as something else that already happened, as that would be significantly more productive. Believe it or not, I had someone come up to me and they tried to use the fact that Jimmy Hart managed Hulk Hogan as proof in and of itself that Hogan couldn't talk. And despite Hulk Hogan being one of the best microphone workers of all time, there are some who incorrectly believe that managers are only for people who can't talk so blindly that they really can't even use common sense. While we still do have the likes of Paul Heyman, it's still safe to say that being a manager is a lost art form, as we just don't have the kind of management that we used to have back in the day. But as a result, there are many out there who inaccurately believe that a manager is simply for wrestlers who can't talk. But by that logic, I guess that means that Mr. Perfect was terrible on the microphone and that Ric Flair couldn't talk. Or maybe that line of thinking is just terribly wrong. The act of having a manager in your crew does not mean you're inefficient on the microphone, as having a manager is part of a complete picture that you're trying to build for someone's character. It is not a slight on your verbal abilities. And furthermore, if you do find yourself linguistically challenged, that doesn't mean that a manager is going to be your cure-all. Bringing up the aforementioned Paul Heyman, let's remember Ryback, let's remember Curtis Axel, and all of the other defunct Paul Heyman guys that never stood a chance, even with Paul E. dangerously at their verbal helm. A manager can only do so much to compensate for a lack of personality. They're managers, not magicians. Well, there you go. Just some of the worst IWC criticisms out there. Let me know which other ones annoy you, and also be honest, which ones are you guilty of saying. Let me know down in the comment section, and please make sure that you give this video a like, and make sure that you're subscribed right here to the Thinking Fans channel. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much to my Patreon supporters, and as always, Dave knows.